Hello, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining me in this session. And just to check things, how many things are, how many people are doing React in their day-to-day job? Almost everybody. Nice. Okay. So, hopefully, you will find this session useful. So, the title of my talk is, 7 deadly sins of React. So I'm going to talk about some of the mistakes, anti-patterns, and, common problems that I have seen when working with React code bases, and also when teaching React as well. So a little bit about me. So I'm Urzel. I work as a full-stack JavaScript consultant. So in the last few years, I've been working with financial technology companies, some SaaS companies, and mainly heavily involved with React single-page applications and front-end heavy lately. And apart from that, I have also been a tutor at Manchester Coast. This is a part-time coding bootcamp where we teach people with no programming background or zero computer science background to some JavaScript, some React, and it's quite fulfilling. I have seen some of my students get jobs as junior developers, which is, if you like what you're doing, I would really, recommend going and teaching what you do as well. It's a great way to learn, and it's a great way to feel satisfaction, more satisfaction than actually just writing some code, I would say. And apart from all those, I also help organize microservice Manchester and Monk.js meetups back in Manchester. So let's get to it. So let's start with, oh, by the way, I'm on Twitter, if you want to be friends, So let's start. So sin number 1, so I call this pattern tightly coupled components, and it goes like this. So we had this input field components in one of the code bases I worked at, and it took one prop called form API. And let's check it out. What is this form API and how it's used? And if you look at it, you will realize, oh, it's tapping into onChange callback and also the onBlur callback. And then the value is set by going form API get value. There's a validation also visible, whether you have an error in that field or not. It goes form API get error first name. Right, okay, but we don't really know what the form API is by just looking at this component itself. So we need to go to the parent component to figure it out. And then you will find, oh, the ultimate parent, is this form component. And if you look closely, you will realize form API is a render prop, right? So then it's passed around to these input fields and other components which kind of directly tap into it. So obviously, this pattern was used in all other input fields across the same code base, and people took the liberty and went further ahead, iterated on this pattern. So then we ended up stuff like this. So there would be, okay, another input field takes form API as one prop, but it also takes this update entitlement function, takes some other props as well. Let's see how it's used now. So you look at the onChange method for this input. It goes, oh, onChange is form API onChange, and onBlur goes update entitlement, right? So I'm not quite sure whether I should be calling form API onBlur along with the update entitlement, or I shouldn't. I'm not quite sure. It's not clear. And what else is wrong with this pattern? I would say it's bad because it's not really reusable. You're kind of tightly coupling your implementation to this form API. What if I wanted to use this input field somewhere I don't have a form or a form API? I can't, because it needs a form API. That's the contract it depends on, right? And the other problem I see with this kind of pattern is that if you are only unit testing your input field, let's say, and you wouldn't be aware any changes that you made to the form or the form API would be detected by your test failures, because you will probably be mocking the form API anyway. So, when it changes, your test will still pass. You wouldn't capture that failure and that input field level. All right, so that's the first sin. Okay. Sin number 2, I call this the prop gluttony. So sometimes people just pass props, They get greedy. So we had this component called the progress steps, And it was about, showcasing the journey of a user. across a wizard or something. So you go like, oh, so you are on step 1 of 3. You're on step 2 of 3. Or you are on the last step or whatever. Right? And it will take 3 props. It will take steps as an array. It will take current index. And it will take current ID. Right? You might be thinking, okay. It takes 2 current things. Let's look at how those props are used. So we go steps.map, so iterate over the steps that you were provided. And for each step, render a step component. But each step component needs to decide 2 things. 1, whether the step is completed, and that's an easy check. It just goes I less than or equal to current index, right? And then it needs to decide whether the user is currently actioning this step or not. So is it the current step or not? And that's done by going is current ID is equal to step.id, right? And if you think about it, you can actually achieve the same behavior without this, current ID prop at all. You can just go I is equal to current index. Simple as that. So this current ID that was provided to this component you didn't need it. You could just simply derive from the existing information that you can do this operation. So I think the main problem here is that, sometimes, I guess juniors tend to do this quite a bit as well, because they think, okay, I know how I can achieve this behavior. I know how I can achieve this functionality. I'm just going to pass this bit of information into my component and then do some conditional logic within the component itself. But I think the first question you should ask should be, okay, what does this component take as props already? And is there any information that I can use to derive the information that I need? And then, only then, you should think, okay, let's pass new props in, right? Because what can be derived should be derived. Cool. Okay, scene number 3, state-greedy components. So we had this really complicated date time picker component in one of our code bases. So we thought it would be a good idea to have a date time picker, and we can write it ourselves. It ended up being very complex, and we had this component had lots of components to it. One of the components was this label at the top of the day picker. So if you have chosen the date, it will say, oh, you have chosen this date in a friendly label way. And this label, we're looking at the class declaration for this label, and it had this state fields, selected date, month, range, and then it said get derived state from props. So it was, overriding this as well. So whenever I see this, my spider senses start tickling. Okay, get derived state from props. We must be doing very smart things here. So then we go, okay, another callback within the same class was this idea of set month year. And if you pay attention, it takes, day as the argument, then it goes this.set state month day, so sets the month at this component layer. But the very next line, pay attention to the very next line, line 31, it goes this.props set month. Okay, so you set the month at this layer, then you kind of told your parent about it as well. Right? So who is in charge of this state field? Is it you? Is it your parents? I don't know. It's hard to tell. So actually we refactored this component once we figured out all that was basically unnecessary. That state shouldn't have been there at all anyway. It should have just lived at the parent. Right? So it's one thing to consider when you're introducing state, whether state should be there or should be higher up. Okay, so scene number 4, visibility prop. This is a very simple one, but this is a very common one that we make as well. So this was in our code base in a model. So we had this model component, which was a class. And then you look at the model component, it does model type of things. It's setting the overflow of the body, whether to display the scroll bar or not. And in the render block, it was creating a portal, attaching itself to the document.body, right? But I want you to pay attention to the top of the render block. So it would go, oh yeah, I might do some conditional checks there and do a conditional render. So you see if it's not open, so if the prop is open is provided as false, it would just return null, so it wouldn't render, right? I mean, we do it all the time. So there's a subtle issue here, because although you return null from the render, that component still gets mounted, and it's a class-based component, so it will come with all these methods, all these parents methods, and all that baggage, and it will be in your memory. So, and the solution is quite simple as well. It's so simple. So all you need to do, you just need to pull your conditional logic to higher up, and you do it in the JSX. So instead of passing an isOpen prop to the model, just do a ternary render. So you could go isOpen, then render the model. Otherwise, don't even touch the model. Don't even instantiate an instance of a model, right? And that will have no memory impact. Okay. Scene number 5. This is so simple, but yet so annoying. So sometimes people go, import list from Weave. Oh, God. Just take the moment to rename your files or to rename your component. Don't make me work too hard. So it's like I need to. If I want to find the list component, I need to go find the Weave file and take a look at it. Just have. Just make it. Equal. What was on the file system is also what's in my editor, kind of thing. All right. Okay. That is a picture of Dan Abramov. And now that I have touched on all aspects of the React Holy Trinity, the state, the props, and Dan Abramov, I want to have a few last words on testing. And I have a confession to make here. This is very hard, but I used to be a non-believer, and in particular, I used to be a non-believer in snapshot testing, right? Because a few reasons. So one, I think there's this arrogance to snapshot testing. It's not really TDD. You just write your implementation, and you say, you know what I did is perfectly fine. It's the state of universe, right? And then you go, and it's quite easy to do it as well. You just go, okay, render up too much snapshot, done. My job here is kind of done, right? But fundamentally, I think my problem with it was this idea that you can just hit update, right? You can just hit U on your keyboard, and the snapshots would be updated. Do I trust that all the developers on this team or on this project, they are going to dive deeper into the snapshot failures and try to really understand why this snapshot test has failed, right? So that was my problem with snapshot testing, really. And then and I do understand it's a good way to increase test coverage. So you could go, okay, find too much snapshot, and then you end up with this snapshot file with 60 lines long, and that's just a test case scenario, right? That's just, just one test scenario is just like 60 lines long. And it fails, okay, who's going to read through this failure? So I think, my main problem with them was, most snapshots ended up being so huge files, and I thought, that's not really maintainable. Nobody's going to read them. And then I found peace, and I saw the solution. I think it was so simple, so evident as well. All you need to do, be specific about your snapshot. Don't put the snapshot against the form. Put it against the prop that you are after. Don't put a snapshot test against the full render. Just put it against the actual element that you're testing. So the snapshot will be quite, granular. It will be smaller, right? So in that scenario, in that very test scenario, when you just share it, change it to be the precise prop that you're after, it ends up being like 10 lines long, a simple object. Anyone can tell you what's going wrong there, when this snapshot fails. All right. So now I believe, snapshots, can be a thing for good. They can be a force for good if you use them granularly and sparingly. Okay. So last one, scene number 7, intimacy with Enzyme. So let's have a look. sometimes people tap into state fields when they are testing their components, right? Because Enzyme lets you do that. You can just grab any instance of a component and you can go .state, or you can go .set state, right? This is possible to do with Enzyme. And I have seen people who actually, abuse this property by just going, okay, I'm going to set the state of the component in the way that I want, and then, maybe put some assertions against how it renders it when it's in that state. And you can also go, okay, you can also put assertions against the, state at that point in time. You can go, what's the component state after I click this button, and then, get a snapshot of that, or get, put an assertion against that state. And I think you shouldn't be able to do this, because let's say, okay, you have your test laid out in this manner. You have, you're putting some assertions against the state. What if I wanted to refactor this component and I changed this state field from X name to Y name, right? The behavior is the same, right? So, but my test will fail. It will say, oh, it's wrong. No, it's not wrong. It's still working. It's working in the same behavioral manner. But because you put your assertions against precisely the X, Y, Z state fields, you know the internals of this component, then that's why it's failing. You should be just testing the behavior. And this is called the black box testing. So if, the idea is that you shouldn't know, as a tester, you shouldn't know the internal workings of a module or a system that you are testing. You should just test, the behavior of it. Do I give these inputs? Do I get these outputs? And, that's all you should care about from the outside world. So, and after I compiled this slides, I haven't used the can see dots, React testing library, but apparently you cannot do this with the React testing library. It's not possible to, manipulate the state or like see the state, internal state of a component that you are testing. So, he says, oh, the end user will, you should only test the end user who will interact with the component, like clicking the button, or like, the passing the props. These are the aspects that you should be trying to exercise. And I, 100% believe that you shouldn't set the state. You should instead try to do something like this, So instead, you should be like, okay, find me the callback or the prop that you are interested in. Is it a button that user is going to click and it's going to make an API call? Okay, exercise that, button click handler and see that the API is being called or whatever, right? And instead of like looking at, oh, when I click this button, the state should change in this manner or not, no. What you should really test for is like, oh, when I click on this button, what's the output, visual output that I should expect to see? Not the state. I don't care about the state if it's not rendering the correct thing, right? So, and in this, if you are writing your test in this manner, you can go refactor, and as long as the behavior is the same, hopefully your test should still be passing. Right. So summary, what we have talked about. So we have talked about, type a couple components. So, make sure the abstractions are, not too eager. Don't try to pass too heavily abstracted components. One reason why we design React components is that to make them reusable. If you are sacrificing the reusability of a component, then you should ask, is that the right abstraction to make here? And the second point we talked about was this, prop gluttony. So if you have any props that you can use to derive some information, then try to derive the information rather than just eagerly trying to pass new props to a component. I heard some horror stories in some agencies where they design these components. Apparently, it takes more than 40 props or something. I was like, okay, maybe that component is just to be like split into many other components, or sure, but something is going wrong there, I would say. And then we talked about state greedy components. So, don't introduce state, eagerly don't think about, whether this component should be using the state, or it should be the parent component should be controlling the state. And, the doctrine of React, we always try to lift state up, so keep that in mind. And if you ever find yourself reading the docs about, should derive state from props, maybe something is wrong, maybe design is wrong. Yeah. And we talked about this idea of usability props as well. Don't try to do the conditional render in the render block of the component. Kind of pull it higher up as well to a conditional render at the parent level that has no memory impact. And keep your names consistent on the file system and your directory structure and within the React code itself. When you are using snapshots, I'm converted, it's fine, but just be specific with, what you're testing. And with Enzyme, if you're using Enzyme, don't, get into state or try to set state. At least try to avoid where possible, and I think that will make your tests more approachable and more, resilient in that manner, yeah. Now I want to actually ask a few questions to the crowd as well, what are the sins that you have come across, or what are the anti-patterns that you have come across? Does anyone have any insight to share?
So we had a problem on our project with prop drilling, which we tried to solve by using context in consumers. So I wanted to ask you a question back on that one as well. So with using such new techniques like that, have you seen any new kind of anti-patterns forming from things like that? Because we definitely found at first that we were trying to apply it at a too granular level, and it was making, it was damaging how reusable our atom level, molecule level components were.
This is for application state management that we're talking about. Yeah, okay. So I haven't, tried context API too much myself. I used it in one React Native project, and I in all fairness, I didn't think that it was an API which is, readily accessible, or it didn't intuitively make sense in a way. It was I think it's quite open to, obviously it's meant for I guess library developers to kind of build some abstractions on top of. So I think it's open for abuse in a way. In that manner, I think it would be better if you're rather than just tapping to context, probably just use Redux or MobX or some other state container solution rather than trying to roll your own. I would say, yeah, because that was my ambition in that project. I didn't want to do. I didn't want to just bring Redux onto this project. I said, okay, I just use this new context API, but then I realized, okay, well, you need to establish some patterns, because it's quite. It's quite open to how you use it, I guess. Yeah. But I'd say, the other way is, I don't think you can ever just have, this is the perfect architecture. You need to make the mistakes, and then you can kind of draw back and go back to the whiteboard and say, okay, this time we know the mistakes we made last time, and we are going to tackle it in this manner. Yeah.
We've come across an interesting kind of reusability anti-pattern where imagine a web app and you have a modal and you decide everywhere in this web app we're going to use this modal. And what ends up happening then is you pass in a load of props.
Yeah.
And you end up customizing the modal
right, okay.
across, but you're trying to reuse this one modal component. Whereas what we're trying to do now is instead of, I guess that's kind of a horizontal slice. If we take vertical slices and say, well, we're comfortable having different types of modals, but we're not going to customize them through loads and loads of props.
Yeah, I think that's that's the don't repeat yourself principle, kind of maybe taken a bit too extreme. Sometimes I guess people make this mistake as well. It's okay, I see that I'm repeating these 10 lines of code in 3 files. I'm just going to pull it out to a utility function or a different component now. Maybe you shouldn't. Maybe it should just be repeated for a while so that you see how it will evolve, and then you come and kind of consolidate it. I think, and then you will end up with situations you have this one model, and this model needs to behave in 600 different ways, and it's you would rather have 6 models. I think that would be more manageable in that scenario. Yeah.
Thanks.
There are two at the front.
Hi there. So really nice talk. So thank you.
Thank you.
So I don't know if it's an AntiButton, but it's something that I end up doing quite a lot of time. So I realized in a post at some point that everyone is actually now using arrow functions as members of classes.
Yeah.
Because the advantage is you have a bind out of the box. So you need to bind in your constructor, in your render, or anywhere else.
Yeah.
Problem is that when you transpile it, basically, that method, that property of a class doesn't get added to the prototype.
Right, okay.
So at stage one, that gets added to the instance of the class. Which means that if you have a component that gets reused, like, let's say, 100 times, let's say you make a chip component, you have 100 instances of that method.
Okay.
So, and that gets basically spikes up your heap. So I don't know if it's an AntiButton, but it's something that I've seen used everywhere. But not many people are thinking about the drawbacks of it.
Right, okay. I wasn't aware. I use them everywhere myself. Yeah, because you don't need to do the bind operation.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
It's like,
sometimes it's a bit ugly.
Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah, but I guess it could be optimized by the transpiler at some point in time. If
hopefully,
probably it will be on the prototype rather than being on each and every instance. Yeah.
Well, it should be binded one way or another. I don't really know how to achieve that. Really.
I haven't investigated the transpiled output to see how they are reflected. But something to consider. Thank you.
So I just wanted to follow on from what the gentleman at the back said about
about model things.
Yeah, the models. So the place where I work, I've seen we have a promo component. So it's like an image, and it can take some data.
Right.
But it's became like a monolithic component, and it becomes a problem because it has too many props.
Yeah.
It's trying to do too many different things and trying to be too custom. But it's a problem with the CSS as well, because the component has CSS. But for the different variations of that promo component, it's like if you want to add a slightly different piece of data to it, and it becomes a problem to customize it because
you'll have so much impact kind of on the existing.
Yeah, and it's hard. It's like you change a tiny little piece for one area of the website, and you kind of don't know if it's going to break all the promos across. So it's like it's a monolithic component, too many props. It's trying to do too many things, and that I think that's an AntiButton.
Yeah, I think in those scenarios you just identify and like kind of try to split it into maybe a few smaller components. With well-defined responsibilities. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. One at the back.
I didn't see who that was. Sorry. So just to follow up on some of the comments about modals and too many props.
Yeah.
One anti-pattern that I've seen a lot is having a lot of conditional logic in one component, which often happens in these monolithic components where we're trying to render like, oh, if this user is this type, then render this. If this user is this type, then render this. So I think this is basically what you said, but sometimes we can use a type prop or something that will decide which component to render based on the input rather than having a bajillion props. And yeah,
definitely. Yeah, I think another one is like people do like maybe crude forms and like the create, and they say, oh yeah, the create and edit and update all can be the same thing. Well, maybe not, because then you just want to implement some intricacy to the create process that needs to live with now the edit functionality somewhere, and it's kind of sometimes I think we should feel okay to duplicate some code. I think it's fine, don't take these, anecdotes like, oh yeah, don't repeat yourself as like religious, like things, so, just, I think it's about conscience, we should be able to make compromises at some point. Yeah, I think that's us for time. Yeah, I will be here, so if you have any other questions or you want to discuss, I'll be around. Thank you.
thank you.